Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
These are troubled times. There is a war ongoing in West Asia, wherein US, Israel and Iran are all lobbing projectiles at each other. But amid all of this warfare, there was one positive news after weeks of negative stories about supply chain disruptions, projectiles, so much death and destruction around. A positive news that some of us saw with a glimmer of hope for what it means for humanity and for science and for space. The Artemis 2 mission by NASA was successful in getting 4 human beings, 4 astronauts, fly around the moon and cross a distance that has never been crossed before. Historically, the distance that we had covered in the 1970s, these astronauts went beyond that. They went farthest from the Earth ever. And to speak about this glimmer of hope, what this mission means for the space age, what this mission means for the race to the moon, I have with me 2 esteemed guests. I have with me Ashwin, who is a space expert at Takshashila and has written about the Artemis 2 launch as well. And we have Aditya, who is a military historian and has also deep expertise in the space history from 1960s onwards. And I'm Lokendra. I'm a tech geopolitics researcher with Takshashila. So maybe Ashwin will start with you, just for the benefit of our listeners. Why don't you just tell us some details, technical details about this mission? What did they launch on 1st of April? Some mission parameters. Who are these astronauts? What kind of rocket did they use? And other things that you think are relevant.
Okay. The launch occurred on the 1st of April in what would become a 10-day mission that would do a flyby around the moon and would come back to Earth. But it was interesting because since this is a down-risking mission, because it is using a bunch of components, vehicles, human-rated spacecrafts that have never actually been tested to this degree before. Anything could have happened. So initially, when the rocket, the SLS rocket, the Space Launch System, it is currently the world's most powerful operational rocket. It will be overtaken by the Starship eventually when Starship becomes operational, but right now it's operationally the most powerful one. Launched off the Floridan launch port, and it inserted the 4 astronauts inside the Orion capsule, which they have named Integrity. The astronauts chose to name it themselves, and they've named it Integrity. When it was inserted into orbit, it was inserted into an orbit called the high Earth orbit. The peculiarity of this orbit is that the astronauts could spend an entire 24 hours in this orbit and still conduct the moon mission later. And they had to basically fly around the Earth and spend a significant amount of time. And this gave them a chance to understand if everything is working as it should. Is all the human functions that the capsule is supposed to do, the human support system functions, is it working properly? All of this was verified. Everything was seen to be in order. And if everything is fine, then they will do a maneuver where they will just use a little bit of thrust using the Orion spacecraft, which will propel them towards the moon. And in effect, it was not even like, the SLS just inserted them into orbit and it was done. It is not even a reusable rocket, so it just expanded away.
Sorry, who developed this SLS? Is it a SpaceX product or a NASA product?
It's a NASA project.
It's a through and through NASA.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they have had a lot of contractors build a lot of things, but yeah, it's a NASA product. And so they don't actually have a rocket, which is interesting. So all of this is just being done with the Orion, the craft, which is using a little bit of its own thrust to enter into a longer orbit from the HEO. And this orbit is so elongated and so long that it will basically take them around the moon. So it is just pure and ingenious orbital mechanics that is enabling the craft to travel these insane distances with very, very little fuel. So it's extremely fuel efficient. And anyway, for the first 3 to 4 days, the astronauts were heading to the moon. And I think just yesterday morning, they reached the moon, they went behind the moon. So the dark side of the moon, which we don't see from Earth, was something that they could observe with human eyes for the first time. Not through a camera, not through a screen, but through human eyes. We have seen this obviously with the landers and the orbiters and the other imaging satellites we have sent before. But this was the first time that humans got to see it from a window on a craft directly. And as a result, we have gotten amazing images of the moon in a way that we've not seen before. And with that, what I liked more was the astronauts themselves seeing it and seeing that it is extremely overwhelming and beautiful, and failing to describe the absolute incredible images that they were able to see. And all of this was live streamed courtesy signal systems that we have today. This is the first mission that has been live streamed throughout, from start to finish, and there has been regular check-ins with the crew. We have heard the crew talk live back to us as and when things were happening. So that has been a great experience for even analysts, space enthusiasts, and scientists on the ground. See all of it happen. So they did the flyby, and then they are now headed back to Earth. They'll come back on Friday. But on their way back as well, they captured an amazing eclipse, the moon eclipsing the sun. And then there was a brief instances of solar coronas visible. It's also an amazing moment to observe the rest of the solar system. There are images with Saturn, Venus visible in that single image. And the another thing is that you could, for the first time, humans observed an Earth rise or Earth set, because the Earth was setting behind the moon, just as we see moonrise and moon sets every day. So now that they're heading back, it has, I'm sure, given them a lot of experience and understanding about how their technology is working under these conditions, and it'll inform all the future missions.
So as of recording this podcast, they're still returning back.
They're coming back.
And when are they expected to splash down?
Friday.
That is which date exactly?
That is 10th.
10th. Okay. So based on your response, Ashwin, it seems to me there are a few highlights from this trip. One is the ingenuity in planning the journey, and planning it in a way that you use gravitation, you use orbital logic, and not fuel as much in going that far. And second, I think, is the idea that this is the first time humans from their own eyes have seen the far side of the moon. And on this, I think I'll bring in Aditya as well. So Aditya, I remember we had a discussion among ourselves before this podcast also. And you had some interesting observations on what it really means for humans to see something on their own instead of images acting as intermediaries. So maybe throw some light on that before we go on to history.
Sure. Thanks, Lokendra. Look, this is just first thoughts, but this really goes back to why human spaceflight in the first place, right? Because there's a lot of things that you can actually meaningfully achieve with machines. So why send humans? And part of the reason is, part of the reason politicians really like it is that it's inspirational. It helps really create the next generation of scientists, technologists, people who are interested in space exploration. So there's that inspirational purpose. It's also an unambiguous demonstration of power, in a competitive international environment. There's also other things, both with with human spaceflight as well as other types of space missions. It helps, boost the aerospace industry and the likes. But really, when you come down to why humans in space, the reasons they're ephemeral. It's hard to grasp at them. And, part of the reason, like you mentioned, is that our experience of space, as with most environments, most of the universe, including most of the Earth, is lethal to humans, right? So your experience is ultimately mediated. Even when you're underwater, your experience has to be mediated. So for most of us, our experience of space is seeing footage. At your most intimate, you will experience space through the window of a spacecraft or the visor of your spacesuit, and that's the most intimate you'll get. And what we saw there was, besides the fact that we had some streaming images as well as more high-resolution images being captured by cameras and then transmitted later, you had the astronauts themselves speaking in plain English not technical jargon. These weren't geologists. They were just speaking in plain language about what they were seeing. They were describing terrain. They were describing what it looked like. They were describing features that sounded like features on Earth. And I think that because humans, because ultimately we think of cameras as representing unfiltered truth, but of course they do filter truth themselves. It's the nature of the lenses. It's the way light is captured, either electronically or in the old days on film. There is, that itself is a form of mediation. So this is, in a sense, the human eyeball Mark 1 is essentially bypassing that and narrating it to us. I think that there's a different effect from that. And I think there's something useful to it because the humans are also mediating it. They're also providing meaning and interpretation with their own brains and narrating that to us. And I think that has a value in itself.
Nice. That was wonderfully put, Aditya. Thanks for those observations. And now we'll go to history. And one of the things that stand out is the historical bit about space exploration and why it took about close to 50 years, if I'm not wrong, for a human space flight to go around moon, right? They have not landed. The 4 astronauts that just went, they circle around the moon. They've still not landed. And we had achieved the feat of landing humans 50 years back. Question 2 is very simple. Why this gap? What happened? As in, certainly we could demonstrate moon landing with very rudimentary technologies, very rudimentary spacecrafts. Maybe at that time in late 1960s, early 1970s, computers used to be so bulky and large with so little processing, right? And still they managed to do it. What went wrong?
I don't know if anything actually went wrong. I would say that my first basic question is why go to the moon, right? I mean, so I think if there's something that went wrong, it was fundamentally the way the Apollo mission was itself conceived. It was conceived in a hurry, and there was no particular project or idea for what you would do after you got to the moon and started doing some explorations, right? What was step number 2? Would you set up some sort of permanent human presence? What was it? The goal was primarily to beat the Soviets to the moon, which the Americans did handily. And once that space race was won, the incentive for these massive budgetary allocations went down. I mean, let's just put this in context, right? So where does the Apollo mission come from? The Apollo mission comes from early 1961. There's a few things happening. Yuri Gagarin's space flight. And 5 days after that, there's the Bay of Pigs invasion, which is a disastrous thing where CIA-backed Cuban rebels basically failed to go and do a regime change in Cuba. And basically, the US is in a back foot. Kennedy's just come to power. And on May 5th, just a few weeks later, the Americans hurriedly put together their own human space flight. They sent Alan Shepard into space briefly. But really, they know they need a win, because they've already been beaten to space for the first time by the Soviets in 1957 with Sputnik. So they want some sort of win. And the win is they decide to put a man on the moon and to bring him back safely before the end of the decade, which means 1969 or 1970. And this decision is being made in 1961. This is crazy, right? So if you're NASA and you're hearing the politicians have made this decision, it just sounds insane, right? It's like if you were working engineering in a company, a salesperson comes to you and says, I've made this promise to the customer, we'll get them this product by next week. It's our biggest contract yet, and you have to do it. So it's a bit like that. So it's really hard. And so it required a massive expansion of NASA's budget. It required the creation of new infrastructure. The Marshall Space Center, what later got renamed the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the Johnson Space Center in Texas and Houston. There was a massive expansion of the aerospace industry in Southern California. So, this is a huge infrastructure project. And all of this is happening as America's involved in a missile race with the Soviets and is involved from 1965 onwards in a major war in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. And so all of this obviously places huge budgetary strains on the US. In fact, part of the reasons that the Soviets don't bother to do this is that they can't run the missile race, keep their society stable, and also do a human lunar mission. So they try other things. Anyway, and I think that was because this was put together in a hurry and it was put together primarily for political reasons. There wasn't much of a vision for what you would do next. And I mean, just to break down the Apollo missions, Apollo 1 to 6 are basically like testing and things like that. Apollo 7 to 10 is where you do some crewed mission. So Apollo 8 in 1968 is actually the one that's closest to Artemis 2 right now, because that's where you have a crew of 3 doing orbits around the moon. Apollo 8 is a bit, Artemis 2 is a little different, but here they were orbiting the moon. And it's the Apollo 8 mission that gives us the first pictures of the Earth in a single frame, as well as the famous Earthrise photo from the moon. And this all happened in late December 1968 during Christmas. So on Christmas Eve in US time, the astronauts were reading from the book of Genesis on live television in a broadcast, which many people found controversial because religion and state and whatnot. So all of that was happening. Remember, 1968 was, if you just think about how eventful the years 1968 to 1972 were. 1968, January was the beginning of the Tet Offensive, in which North Vietnamese and Viet Cong guerrillas basically launched a massive offensive into South Vietnam. This is the period of massive youth protests all around the world. You had the protests at Dhaka University in East Pakistan, Prague Spring. You had the Cultural Revolution in China. So you have this massive youth uprising throughout the world. You have increasing inflation, economic crisis. 1969 onwards, there's a major change in world politics because the Soviet Union and China clash at the Ussuri River border. And by late 1971, 1972, you have this diplomatic revolution where essentially the Chinese open up to the Americans.
Yeah.
And this happens in the backdrop of the Bangladesh war. So this is an extraordinarily eventful period.
Yeah.
The late 60s and early 70s, very tumultuous. And it's exactly in this period that the Apollo missions take place. So you have Apollo 11 in 1969, and then 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17, all of which are successful missions. 13, there's an oxygen tank blows up, so the spacecraft has to do a orbit around the moon, has to do and basically use it as a gravitational slingshot to get back to Earth. In fact, until Artemis 2 went off on this mission happened, the astronauts on Apollo 13 were held the record for the furthest flight from Earth because of the route they had to take to come back to Earth. And the other thing that I think is not appreciated is how much more complex the Apollo missions got. Apollo 11 was like a few hours, and you at most moved like 250 meters away from your spacecraft. By Apollo 17, they spent 3 days on the moon. They traveled about 35 kilometers from their aircraft. They were able to do this because from Apollo 15 onwards, they started using lunar buggies. They basically had moon cars. So they were going around the moon. They were collecting samples. You had geologists collecting rocks. You had, I think even if you look at the mass of samples brought back, I think it was about 20 kilos for Apollo 11. For Apollo 17, it was more than, I think it was 110 kilos.
Wow.
So the way these missions had, in very short order, had completely changed, become so much more complex and ambitious, I think is underappreciated. And it was underappreciated by ordinary people, because, in a sense, it had become routine for missions to go to space. I think people didn't appreciate what a completely extraordinary thing this was, to go to the moon. And, by 1972, the US was exhausted. It was exhausted financially. It was exhausted politically at home. There was a political upheaval. You had, in that decade of the 60s, you had the assassinations of JFK, his brother RFK, and Martin Luther King, just as an example. You had the DNC riots of 1968 and all. So the US itself was in major political, social upheaval. And the last thing that the Americans wanted at that time was to do more moon missions. There just simply wasn't the budgetary support for that sort of thing. So,
and I think by that time they're far overtaken any other competitor when it came to moon or anything related to space.
They'd done what they'd set out to do, which is to beat the Soviets, and the Soviets weren't going to catch up.
But then, okay, fine, we can still understand why they were, not wanting to do anything more in 1970s. But even let's say in 2000s and 2010s, in the first 20 years of this particular century, still we didn't have any moon missions. Maybe I'll bring in Ashwin for this contemporary bit. Why do you think for the last 20 years nothing happened on the moon front?
Honestly, things have happened. It's just not gotten a lot of coverage. The thing is, there weren't human spaceflight missions. We weren't sending humans to the moon anymore because sending humans is going to just balloon the costs to a great degree. And practically, you can do a lot of things with just machines. So we still had rovers, landers that have gone to the moon before this mission. I mean, especially after the turn of this millennia, there has been so many moon missions, including from our country. And there has also, that whole ecosystem has been developing. NASA has still been funding missions. There are still new entrants into the whole lunar exploration economy. More countries are participating. All of that is happening. And we are continuing to map the surface of the moon much better. We have been understanding it a lot better. We have had orbiters around the moon that have constantly transmitted information, and countries are cooperating. So a lot of this has happened. It's just that none of it was envisioned at a grand scale and with the motive of having boots on the ground, which is what is different about Artemis and all the other competing missions.
Ashwin, what you're saying is essentially since Apollo missions ended until now, there were a lot of moon missions that still happened, including by India and other players, that didn't send humans around the moon, but sent machines that did a lot of roles, including experiments, including, I think there's including sending rover on the moon surface, so on and so forth. So in that case, what changes maybe 5-10 years back when humans going back to moon is again back to the table? What changes?
This is an emergent phenomenon because of few things changed the equations and tipped the scales towards, more ambitious lunar missions.
Okay.
One, I would say, is falling launch costs. It was extremely expensive to launch a rocket with a lot of with a heavy payload all the way to the moon, and that has always been a deterrent in undertaking lunar missions. It would also stretch timelines, all of that. But as the rocket technology has improved over the decades, it is now a lot cheaper. And that means we already see the explosion of activity in the lower Earth orbit. But the logic extends, right? That means it's also going to eventually extend to the geosynchronous orbits, or eventually the cislunar space, and then to the moon itself. So that is one big reason, and that changes the economics. And at the end of the day, economics matter. As Aditya outlined, one of the biggest factors that Apollo could not sustain over the long term was because of the prohibitive costs. And so with the launch costs changing and that being a foundational layer for space access, that changes a lot of things. People start thinking, what can I do on the moon? Space agencies, private companies, everyone, right? That is one. Second is there is competition again. US was the predominant space power for a long time, but now you have many countries picking up their own capability, especially China, and they have shown remarkable progress with their Chang'e missions over the last few years. They have, in some metrics, ahead of the US in terms of what they have achieved. So there is a fear in the West, and to note that Chinese also want to land their own astronauts to the moon. So there is this whole fear in the US that they will beat us there. The Chinese will beat Americans to the moon and then use the opportunity of their presence there to dictate norms, to create keep out zones, to corner the most valuable parts of moon for themselves. Because fundamentally, despite moon being basically devoid of any human activity, and we can, every time a moon mission is planned, we can basically target any part of it. But that they are scared that might change, because if you think about it, the most valuable parts of moon are actually very concentrated regions. Moon's gravitational field is not uniform. And that means below 100 kilometer orbit around the moon, you only have 2 stable orbits. So there is only 2 stable orbits below 100 kilometer mark where satellites can be stably, revolving around the moon. And those are valuable places for moon observation, just as we do Earth observation here. So there are these constraints. There are then the Lagrange points, which are limited. There are only 5. There is also instances of there are these deep craters in the moon that have been permanently shadowed for billions of years and are supposed to do contain water ice. And the economic bet is that this will get mined and start being exploited as a resource for fuel for human functions and all of that. Maybe some of the most viable sites for these for the water ice is limited. So there is a lot of these maybes and what ifs, which are legitimate concerns. And so there is a fear on both sides that we have to, get to what we want first. We shouldn't let the other one.
So there's a lot at stake right now for the US.
Theoretically, yes.
Okay. But based on what Aditya said and what Ashwin you said, it seems to me in a very generic sense that US missions to moon have always been motivated by fear. Earlier it was Soviet Union and now it is China. Is it a good generalization to make?
No, that's, I think, overstating the point, because, see, they have been doing this, doing other things anyway. They were, for a long, there has been the commercial lunar payload system that they have, they're propping up their private industry to be able to carry things to the moon, so that when they eventually, if the lunar economy eventually actually pans out, then they'll have a well-functioning trucking system between Earth and moon. So they have been doing things already. Maybe the rhetoric goes up, maybe the human space flight aspect of it goes up. They would have done things slowly anyway, perhaps, but now some of that gets accelerated, and terming it as fear also gives it a negative connotation. But why don't you just see it as competition? And that's been true for every single technological field around the world, for every country, right? You need competition, otherwise why would you'll have a billion different priorities. Why would you choose this particular one? So it's everything that we have, everything the US has done. I mean, it's just a narrative arc, and how you going to spin it.
So Aditya, a question for you is, and this is again from the conversation we just had. You spoke about humans seeing the far side of the moon for the first time, and you eloquently described what it meant. And then I think Ashwin also spoke about the space race and, the fear about China claiming some things and maybe setting some rules, so on and so forth. So my question to you is, why do humans matter, right? In addition, like, we can send machines and machines can go to moon, they can circle around the moon. But is it that humans also add certain weight to the optics, to the narrative, or to the idea that, you're establishing some claim in a legitimate fashion, or you're setting some rules? For that entire enterprise, do humans matter?
Absolutely. So one is just the unambiguous optics of having people in space or on the moon. It's an expensive task. It's a very complex and technologically advanced undertaking. So that's proof of your prowess. Second, like you said, just having human presence there adds to your legitimacy, to your claims to be able to do this. So it adds to your legitimacy as a major power. It also adds to your legitimacy to the moon itself, right? I mean, the way we think of legitimacy or sovereignty on Earth is in terms of human occupation. Now, nobody's claiming sovereignty on the moon. That's not on the cards right now. But you're claiming a moral right to explore the moon and to use the moon by putting humans there, putting them at risk there, because this is ultimately a very risky undertaking. But I think that's, I will just add that Artemis is in some ways quite different from the Apollo programs, because it requires, as of now, it's much less demanding in terms of its budgets, and there's a lot more experience going behind this. As Ashwin pointed out, a lot of the building blocks have been put in place. Two of the big ones are, we have understood a lot more about human space flight. So for the last now quarter century, humans have maintained a continuous presence in low Earth orbit, and that's a huge amount of data and experience that goes into planning lunar missions. The second is that, unlike Apollo, Artemis is heavily, there's a great deal of international collaboration. So JAXA, the European Space Agency, others are involved in various aspects of the program. They're building various support systems. The Europeans are building a logistics lander, and that brings us to something else about Artemis, which is it's, I think, conceived more carefully. It is conceived in terms of infrastructure. So they want to be able to move goods. They want to be able to support astronauts there for longer times with existing, by providing them logistics on the site. and also that their ideas to eventually have some sort of constellation of satellites around the moon to provide positioning, to provide imagery, to provide communications, and so on. So there's a much more broader conception. Now, there are some risks and challenges. Risks along with this, I will say. One is there's the conceptual risk of, Artemis involves, like Ashwin mentioned, the SLS. But what if, there are private companies that figure out a more efficient way of doing this stuff? What does that mean for the Artemis program? The second is technical, which is, Artemis. One of the ways Artemis tries to be sustainable is what Ashwin mentioned about water in the permanently shadowed regions, the PSRs. And the idea is to do more in situ resource utilization. But what if it turns out that that's not a great idea? We'll only know by doing. So there's that risk. And finally, there's the budgetary risk. As with the early 70s, real life can get in the way. What if the budgetary support for this sort of mission evaporates? Then what happens with Artemis? I think that will be interesting to see.
Thank you, Aditya. So I think we'll move towards conclusion of this podcast. But before that, Ashwin, can you outline what are the next steps for Artemis? Because I understand this is a series of launch. This is Artemis 2nd. So what is immediately the next step going forward?
So the next steps will involve bringing in the private participation in the program, just so that the systems are tested and the technology is more down risked. So the Artemis 3 will basically not even go to the moon. It will happen around the Earth itself in the lower Earth orbit. It will conduct a few docking experiments using the 2 privately made landers. It will see how the docking goes, and it will also test the spacesuit that the Axiom is designed, which is also a privately led effort. And that will to draw a parallel. Aditya was mentioning this. This is Artemis 3 is a lot like Apollo 9. Which also did not go to the moon, but actually tested a lot of things around Earth before embarking on the big journey to the moon in the next mission. And that is what Artemis 4 is going to do. It is going to actually take crew to the moon. Similarly, on the Orion space capsule. And on the moon itself, there will be a lander waiting for it, which will be pre-positioned. And using the lander, the astronauts will land on the moon, conduct a few EVA activities, stay there for a short duration, and just come back. And that will be the moment that humans return to the moon since the Apollo program. And that is Artemis 4, which will again basically be just testing crew landing and all of that on the moon. Then Artemis 5 is going to be a more elaborate mission. It's again going to take the crew there, but they will use a rover. They will spend about a week on the moon. They will start building what is eventually going to become a permanent lunar human base. That's the intention. And to that effort, they'll stay there for a week, and a lot of those activities will go on at that point. And I think for that, there is the Blue Origin's lander has been baselined. And beyond Artemis 5, there is Artemis 6, 7, and so on. At that point, we don't know what is in store. It depends on the progress that these missions make, but we can assume that it will be more efforts towards the lunar base. It will also try and bring in more private players so that the launch costs don't stay high. Right now, I think around 4 billion is being used for every launch. So that price will be targeted. The Jared Isaacman, the NASA chairman, has said that they would desire a launch every 10 months or so. And they're going to target that launch cadence from after the Artemis 5 mission. Let's see how it goes, but it's exciting times to be observing all this and to be in this era of lunar spaceflight.
Thank you so much, Ashwin. And I think there are some parallels, Aditya, with the time a lot of Apollo launches happened. It was also a time of turmoil. This is also a time of turmoil. And so many launches have been planned with Artemis, and so many launches happened with the Apollo. So definitely from a space point of view, this is going to be an exciting time. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me. I think Ashwin's grasp for the technicalities and ability to explain them in a very understandable fashion, and Aditya's grasp for the history bit really complemented and enriched this discussion. So listeners, if you have any thoughts, if you have any comments or disagreements, please feel free to let us know. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.